Kia ora koutou, everybody. Ko Hugh Takuingawa. Hei kaiwha kako ngā tua ahu ki manaki whenua. Morning, it's Hugh Gourlay here. I'm a senior researcher here in the Biocontrol of Weeds team at Manaki Whenua. And welcome back to our Biosecurity Bonanza webinar series again, which is really cool to do these again and have you all back. So this morning we're going to hear from Angela Brandt, one of our sort of more senior scientists from down in Dunedin, one of our Dunedin research areas. And she's going to talk to us about the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's call to action on native ecosystem weeds. So Angela, take it away.
Thank you, Hugh. And I think everyone can see that now. Tēnā koutou katoa. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's investigation into management of native ecosystem weeds. And I was seconded to assist the team on this investigation with the report that was released last November. And I will say that this was a tremendous investigation. It resulted in a report that was 9 chapters long with 7 recommendations. It included a personal introduction from the Commissioner and an excellent, thorough, but succinct overview. But it clocked in at a total of 233 pages. So I recognize that perhaps not all of you will have read it, but I entreat you to at least read the overview, as it is a real excellent insight into what the report as a whole talks about. But what I'm guessing is not a surprise to anyone on this call. It's pretty reasonable that this was quite a long report, because there is quite a number of weeds or exotic plants in New Zealand. Of course, more than 25,000 exotic plants have been introduced to New Zealand. Approximately 3,000 of these are growing in the wild. And approximately 1,800 of them, as of 2021, had naturalized, so they have self-sustaining populations in the wild. So this is a lot of species and a lot of things to sort of take in and think about managing. But at the time of the report, that the report was released, there were 334 weeds that were regulated as pests. So they're listed in regional pest management plans. This includes pests that are causing harm to both production systems and to native ecosystems. But there are 380 species that are managed on conservation land. So they're considered environmental weeds by the Department of Conservation. So we know that there are quite a few species that we already expect to be causing harm. But then there's a lot more that are around in New Zealand that we have to think about what might they be doing and potentially preempting any harm they might cause. So what I'm going to do today is really briefly touch on the breadth of the PCE report, but I want to move quickly into thinking more about what might we all want to do and think about and respond to in terms of this report, and thinking about what we can do to support the recommendations. So first off, as I said, 9 chapters in the report. This is a very brief and my sort of personal quick summary of what those chapters are about. The first chapter is an introduction to the report. It sets out the scope, defines a weed, which as we would use in common parlance, it's a plant that's a problem in a certain place. And therein lies one of the major challenges when thinking about managing weeds, is that in one context, they could be harming native ecosystems, for example, but in another context, they could be quite economically, culturally, ornamentally valuable. So we have therein quite a bit of challenge in managing them right from the get-go. The second chapter is a bit of a primer on invasion ecology and the current state of invasion in New Zealand. And here I've just pulled out an invasion curve, thinking about how weeds don't become widespread overnight necessarily, and some take longer to spread across the areas that they are able to inhabit. And so another challenge for management is what stage of invasion is that weed at? What could it do in the future? And that leads me to chapter 3, which is future threats from weeds. And again, I'm guessing not too much of a surprise to anyone here on this call that for the most part, we expect that weeds are only going to become more of a problem collectively in the future with climate change, with land use change, with simply the number of species that are naturalized but not yet weeds or managed as weeds. We think those things combined along with other factors are going to mean we have more to manage in the future than we do now and more threats. Chapter 4 talks about what do we know about weeds, what kind of information we have, but also how well able are we to access that information. Chapter 5 is about prioritizing which weeds to manage, where and how, and this interacts quite a bit with that invasion curve. So as weeds become more widespread, we actually then have more of a challenge in terms of what kinds of management outcomes we might feasibly be able to achieve. Chapter 6 and 7 go together. Chapter 6 is about the regulatory system for exotic plants, and Chapter 7 talks about what's happening in practice. Major players, how are they involved in managing weeds at the national, regional level? So focuses largely on MPI, Department of Conservation, and regional councils. And then Chapter 8 describes 4 case studies of local groups, largely community groups, that are really doing some amazing work in some situations that a lot of us might balk at, taking on some really challenging weed problems. And then Chapter 9 is the list of 7 recommendations. So what I'm going to focus on a little bit is a bit out of that introduction and those recommendations to think about to spur my challenge essentially to all of us here. So first off, these are the questions that the report aims to answer. And I'm simply going to read these out to inform what I'm going to talk about a bit later. So first, are the ecological risks posed by exotic plants to the integrity of New Zealand's native ecosystems adequately known? Are these ecological risks then adequately understood by the organizations and individuals charged with managing exotic plants in native ecosystems? Do these organizations and individuals charged with management have the information, skills, and resources necessary to do a good job? Are they making sensible, strategic choices about where resources get spent, given the nature of emerging and future challenges? Is the regulatory system fit for purpose in light of the above? And are all organizations, groups, and individuals coordinated and incentivized in their efforts to manage the right exotic plants? And as you might guess, the answers to all of these are, there might be some good things going on, but there's also some things that perhaps we need to work on. And that leads, of course, to the 7 recommendations from the report. And as I mentioned in the blurb, the sort of abstract for this talk, these recommendations are largely aimed at the oversight, the leadership in the system. So the audience here is Parliament, but also ministers and those central government agencies that have the most oversight in the biosecurity system. And so these first 4 recommendations really highlight that focus of the report on the audience. So looking for clearer direction from the ministers of biosecurity and conservation, more joint leadership from MPI and DOC, because we're talking about native ecosystem weeds, and so really bringing together the formal oversight of the biosecurity system with that mandate for managing conservation land that DOC has. And then a look at how could policy direction focus better on native ecosystem weeds when the incentives, the goals for managing those do not lead to direct economic gains. We're talking about potentially other types of values, right? But then what I'd like to especially highlight is the last 3 recommendations, which I think is where we, and by we I'm thinking researchers, practitioners, those who are really on the ground, can actually inform up into what happens at that oversight level for the responses to these recommendations. So recommendation 5 is about policy requiring engagement with iwi and hapu and having some minimum content, some prioritization at a national scale that involves expert input, coordinated management, more systematic and resourced surveillance. Managing emerging weeds, and this includes aspects of surveillance as well, more systematic surveillance. And then coordinating those national and regional efforts so that they're working together to get the best outcomes, the most efficient outcomes, and meet our goals. Recommendation 6 is about that access to information and knowing what do we know, being better able to say what do we know and what do we not know, where are the gaps. And to achieve this, the report recommends a single authoritative and publicly accessible database with all the information we have on weeds being produced and maintained. Recommendation 7 is about putting together an emerging risks team that would scan for and coordinate management of new weeds, because it is better in a lot of ways and more feasible to tackle and manage, potentially eradicate weeds earlier in that invasion curve before they've spread widely and really started to cause harm. So what I pose to you today is a bit of a challenge, or at least I'd like to open a conversation about what role we can all play in acting on these recommendations and trying to really see where can we fit into answering or doing better at answering some of those questions that the report posed. So can we be filling gaps where risks aren't known? Can we communicate those risks better? Can we make information, skills, and resources more available? Can we better enable good strategic choices? And I realize good is a value-laden term here. So what I mean by good is defensible, documented. We know what information was used. We can adapt those choices as we gain new information. And others would be able to understand why those choices were made, for example. Can we inform changes to the regulatory system? Can we build more effective partnerships and networks using a lot of the models of good partnerships and networks we do have at different local or regional or even national scales already? And then thinking about those 3 recommendations, what can we be doing to help make these recommendations become reality? And in many cases, we actually do have some ideas. We have some past work, current work, and so on that can actually help us think about what we want to do more and provide some ideas and actually jumpstart a response here. So what I've done is I've pulled together some different projects or things I know about that I've been thinking about when I look at the report and these recommendations. And totally own my bias here that I know a little bit more about what my colleagues at Manaki Whenua have been doing, but I know there's heaps of work going on in other organizations and that a lot of you, I'm guessing, are doing. I can't, of course, see you, but I know some of you who are here have a lot of work under your belts about this. So just some examples here. Working collectively. So we have some models, and some of these are mentioned in the report as well, of systems for thinking in a more collective or at a more national scale, and also of trying to incorporate those bottom-up, local knowledge, as well as bring sort of knowledge from other places together. So the National Biocontrol Collective is an example, regional councils pooling funding, thinking about national priorities to work on getting biocontrol agents that everyone would then have access to. The National Wild and Conifer Control Program, bringing local groups' knowledge together, but also facilitating information spread from what's learned through research or through others' actions. We could probably try to pull out what do we really like about how these operate, how could we adapt what we know here. But it's also about what I'm thinking about with working collectively is how do we incorporate all of the different kinds of knowledge we have? How do we bring multiple knowledge systems, multiple disciplines together? Part of this is about how do we better incorporate Mātauranga Māori as well as Māori values, Te Ao Māori worldview with Western science knowledge and information and values. Other types of disciplines, such as using the Survey of Rural Decision Makers, and the last few times it's run, there have been questions about weeds, so we can actually gain information about how landowners, how the public thinks about weeds. And we can pull in some of that social science knowledge as well, because it is about values. As I said, we want to control a species in some places because it's a weed, but in other places that same species might be essential to a certain industry. Another idea is some strategies for management. We have a strong history of risk assessment in Aotearoa New Zealand, past 20 years at least. Colleagues from Manaki Whenua, but also a lot of others have built up some approaches and thinking about prioritization and how we understand risks, and that can help us understand where knowledge gaps are. There's work continuing into detection methods and surveillance, and I've just pulled out a photo of a couple very cute dogs from the most recent Putaio issue from Manaki Whenua. These dogs are being trained to detect kauri dieback, so not any weeds, but I know that some dogs are being trained to detect weeds as well. And then control techniques. The report specifically says it is not just, focused on what kinds of control techniques and what effectiveness those have, but we have lots of knowledge and lots of information on control techniques, including, of course, our world-leading biocontrol team at Manaki Whenua that you'll be hearing more from, of course, over this week. And I just happened to pull this out because I thought it was quite appropriate that the most recent weed biocontrol newsletter issue featured a story on the biocontrol agent of Chilean flame creeper, which is the species that is depicted on the cover of the PCE report. So we have quite a bit of knowledge we can build on, and how could we use that even more effectively. But I also just wanted to stick in here a little what if question. So thinking about strategies for management, there's also work ongoing that many people have been doing, thinking about where might we not actually use certain control methods or remove weeds, because actually if we want to promote ecological integrity of a system, there are other things we can do that enable the native plant community to thrive, for example, and outcompete the weeds that are there. And that might be a more effective approach than removing a weed, creating potentially a weed-shaped hole that then other weeds can invade, or affecting the native community in such a way that it actually can't thrive as well. So some things to ponder there. And then getting the best use out of information. We already have some existing databases and approaches, and these tools are developing over time. There's a lot of things we can do now that we couldn't do 10 years ago. So one database that that Manaki Whenua maintains is the New Zealand Organisms Register, which is a way to have a consistent taxonomy, consistent set of names to use for species that are in New Zealand, and therefore we know we're talking about the same species, for example. But also other databases that Manaki Whenua manages. The new Biota of New Zealand website is the refresh, putting together of information on different species groups, including plants. So this is replacing the plant names database, for example, and also the National Vegetation Survey Data Bank, where we have vegetation plot data. Both of these have information on occurrences of weeds as well as native species, and those are uploaded to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which therefore has very consistent data standards. We can understand each piece of data in there and how it was collected, but also that GBIF is pulling data from other places like iNaturalist. So it's a way to really put information together to get the most out of it and to understand maybe where we have some gaps. But other than sort of specific data, there's also different ways we can look at how to pull out scientific information to support decision-making and policies. So there's a team at Manaki Whenua that has been working with the Conservation Evidence Project at the University of Cambridge and thinking about how we could synthesize existing evidence on different kinds of management interventions, use that, adapt those for a New Zealand context, for example. So a way to really summarize and make evidence that's out there available to anyone trying to make a decision rather than everyone individually having to search out all of the papers, reports, et cetera, that exist on a certain topic. And finally, a little bit of a future focus. So where are known weeds going to pop up next? It's really a pertinent question, and it's something explicitly covered in the PCE's report. It can be a very challenging question. There's lots of reasons that a weed can grow in a certain place. One, of course, though, is the climate is such that it can support that weed growing, reproducing, and et cetera. And so taking just a couple climate variables, temperature and precipitation, and projecting how those will change in the future can give at least some idea of where could different exotic plant species actually grow in the future compared to where they're currently able to survive. And I've pulled out just a couple examples from a recent paper by some colleagues of mine at Manaki Whenua where they looked at the current and future potential distributions of exotic conifers in New Zealand. And these two examples show that different species are going to have different responses. There's a caveat that the information is, data is somewhat limited. You can't guarantee that this is true, but you can see that there's a suggestion here that radiata pine, for example, may not have as favorable an environment in the northern parts of New Zealand in the future, whereas southern parts it may actually be able to expand where it could grow in the wild. Norfolk pine, on the other hand, has quite a few areas where it could potentially grow where the climate is currently not favorable. It's naturalized. I don't think it's especially weedy, but who knows if that could change that. But also, importantly, we should think about, and this alludes back a bit to my what if, is the job done after we've controlled a weed population? There's quite a bit of work that's been done with wilding conifers showing how they alter soils, for example, and that influences whether the native community can come back in after conifers have been controlled. We want to know, well, we would probably want to know, was that going to happen for other kinds of weeds? And that would want to influence how we think about managing them and what we might have to do after we've actually removed weeds from an area. So I think that's enough from me for now, but I hope I've given you some things to think about and maybe spurred some either questions or comments that you'd want to ask or propose. And I'm keen to hear from you today, but I'm also keen to carry on this conversation in the future. So with that, I will take some questions.
Fantastic, Angela. Thank you very much. Obviously, from that talk, one of our truly outstanding scientists, especially to be invited onto such a commission and involved in developing these kind of policies and things. There's been a couple of questions, Angela. This is from Keith Salmon. He says, are you aware of the econet.nz weed app, which would allow all volunteers and users to have a named ArcGIS login to record location and management of weeds? It's based on the STAMP Facebook model. So STAMP is the Society Totally Against Moth Plant, I think, which is something that I've been involved in as well. It has over 22,000 weed instances recorded already. It is part of an integrated solution to community groups with an interface, I missed that, but to a contact relationship management system.
It sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm not sure that I'd heard explicitly about that. And that is exactly the kind of thing that I think is excellent about us actually all getting together to talk to each other. Yeah, thank you. Exactly what I'd been thinking. There are some things we have here that we could be using. How can we put those together and actually link them up? Because that's excellent. And making things more accessible to more people. I think that's another really neat aspect of what you've mentioned there. Thank you.
Cool. Keith's left us email address as well, so we will be able to catch you later. Margaret Stanley also has made a comment. She says, thanks, Angela. One of the trickier things is the visibility of widespread weeds to the community and their desire for eradication, given predator-free New Zealand, when best practice is to focus eradication on emerging weeds. How do we overcome this disconnect given pressure from communities?
Thanks, Margaret. That's an excellent question and certainly a challenging one. And I think this is part of where, well, it'll be essential to one of my what if questions and something I didn't mention in my what if, but it is that point that you've started to make that actually we do have so many weeds, we're not going to be able to eradicate them all. It's simply not going to be feasible. And for some, we are always going to have a seed source because, as I mentioned, we have those values for some of those species. So it's an excellent point that you make that in some cases we're specifically not going to be getting rid of certain weeds. But actually what we need to be doing is raising our education and our ability to communicate what goals we are trying to achieve. So this might, and I hope, this might be an idealistic view, but I hope that some of the shifting discussion from either controlling or eradicating weeds, perhaps, to actually looking at how we can achieve ecological integrity. So if we have, especially at a wide scale view, so if we have some weeds that are going to stay, but in certain maybe lower numbers, and that's where things like biocontrol are going to be excellent approaches in many, many cases. They're at least going to be, those weeds are going to be at lower numbers where they're not going to actively harm the integrity of those ecosystems or certain ecosystems, right? So if we can perhaps start to shift some of the conversation, but also I suppose at the same time, I would encourage all local groups who are really keen to be working in some of their local areas where they really value and want to remove certain species, then how can we best support them and encourage them to be doing that? So in a way that I suppose is most effective. But yeah, balancing that is going to be a challenge for sure.
We should, having seen Margaret Stanley on the TV recently talking about pampas, I noticed a number of comments on Facebook were about, does Margaret have a blog? So maybe people like Margaret need to actually start having a blog of some sort or another. Andrea McCormick is another one who's asked a question about, given the multiple databases existing and their different purposes, do you think a single authoritative database is a realistic option?
That's an excellent question as well. I think there are a couple of different points to that, and one might be which information do we really need to have in one place that is consistent, that we need to base, a consistent as a consistent point of reference. And one obvious example would be taxonomy. We need to know that we're talking about the same species, and we need to know what other information is linked to each species and be pretty clear on that. So in some cases, that could be the best approach. For other cases, perhaps it is about how we link to different databases. And I'm not, I should say, I'm not an informatics person, so I think there are definitely some very smart people that we should get involved in thinking about what this looks like in practice, especially in terms of how do we best maintain such a database. And different platforms will be better at sharing different types of information. But I think having it more accessible and things that are, and databases that are clearly maintained and are easily findable and linked in some way is a definite step forward.
Cool. Keith Simon has asked another question here. What place do you see local government having in this framework?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think local government has a huge role to play here. it definitely is the case that local government is doing a lot of management in the regions, but also it's important to see how can we better support local government to be achieving both the regional priorities as well as thinking about what's kind of that national priority. Because in some cases, what's a regional priority might also be a national priority. You know, on the South Island, we don't necessarily want to be receiving some of the problematic weeds that several regions on the North Island are already facing, and perhaps we should be, you know, pooling resources, because that's a really effective way for us to prevent it getting here, for example. But also that's where local government's going to have a lot of local knowledge to bring to this. So I think local government has a huge role to play here, and in particular because there's an explicit regulatory function as well, an expectation. So given that local government has an expectation to be managing weeds in regions, you should have input into how the system can be working most effectively and efficiently for you too.
Cool, thanks Angela. Claire Woolridge Way has made a comment rather than a question. This is really cool, and we will look at that later. Thanks Claire. She's also asked about how to become a fully badged up member of STAMP. I think you do that on Facebook. I'm not 100% sure, somebody else might correct me, but if you go into Facebook and type in STAMP in the search engine, I think you'll find it there. Clear. Right, James Harbord, he has written, Kia ora Angela, ngā mihi for your koreo. Can you advise on glyphosate impacts in wetland environments, particularly for controlling willows, and the what if questions of what we can do next, post controls for native recruitment enhancement? Cheers, James Harbord, Doc Senior Biodiversity Ranger.
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm probably not the best person to specifically answer, but we do have some ongoing longer-term research looking into, I think, basically all those questions you've posed. So there's some work going on in wetlands looking at controlling willows, what's happening next. I don't know how much the effects of glyphosate are being explored, but that is definitely a hot topic across all kinds of weed control efforts. So that's, I'm sure, on the mind of various people working in that area. So I will definitely encourage my colleagues working in that program to be sharing their results as soon as possible on that work.
Cool. I think we'll probably take one or two more questions, but this is from Anna Hooper. Great presentation, Angela. I wonder how we can best carry on this conversation about how we can work together to input into the uptake of these recommendations. What could be the next steps to help with the uptake of the recommendations? Is there a place for coordination, facilitation across the multiple players involved in weed management across the country?
That's an excellent question from Anna, and a good challenge to me to think about what might this look like. So there isn't a formal coordination going on. I've been trying to put out some feelers and gather information, but I think it definitely would be good to be looking at what kinds of networks we have and how we might connect up some of those networks, indicating interest. And also where are places where some of us might be coming together in future. So at the NETS conference in Christchurch in August, for example. So I'm hoping to attend that, and I would definitely love to talk to anyone else who's keen to talk more about this. But I'm also keen to be contacted and perhaps try to get more of us in touch, where I'd really like to hear from others who have some ideas about how this might work and aligns with some of those other kinds of networks that do exist out there.
Yeah, just sort of thinking about such things. Our weed biocontrol team that I've been involved in for such a long time, we network with regional councils, DOC, NIWA, and other organisations and universities throughout New Zealand with the work that we do. Of course, we're only working on biocontrol of weeds in a relatively narrow, short list of weeds that we work on as well. But we do work across a number of those organisations and groups throughout New Zealand ourselves. So last question, oh no, someone said about the last question, but Rima Herber. So Ian Henkin from DOC runs a weed liaison group where people working in the weed space in Christchurch all meet up and share knowledge and what they're doing. It's an excellent initiative. So sorry, it's not really a question, it's a comment from Rima, but thank you. And I think that's about it. We've kind of done most of the questions and the comments. So thank you very much, Angela. Thank you to all of you guys who came along and attended and joined in. And hopefully you can all get to the NETS conference in Christchurch in August this year. And the organisers would be very pleased to have lots of people attending the conference. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.